Hello, kind people, and welcome to the highlight video of the fifth round of 2020 Tata Steel tournament in Vaikanze. And for this video, I've chosen the game that the Iranian teenager Alireza Firouzja played with the white pieces against Anish Giri. It's a long game, and there's plenty there to talk about. So let's go to the board. As you can see, this is their first ever encounter, and it was quite a game. Alireza opened with 1d4, showing that he already is a multifaceted player in terms of opening theory. He won a very nice Caro-Kann game against Vladislav Artemiev earlier in this tournament, which I've covered in a different video. And on that note, I want to apologize for the sound issues that were entirely my fault in the videos I recorded yesterday. I hope there will be no problem today. d4, Anish replies with d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and maybe with the intention to slightly surprise Alireza here. I'm not entirely sure why Anish settled on this move order, but Anish plays the bishop e7, which is a very well-known move in the Queen's Gambit. Declined, obviously, but not part of Anish's, I think, everyday repertoire. cd5, e5, bishop f4 is how you're supposed to reply here with white if you want to play a game that doesn't switch back to very well-known positions after knight f3, knight f6, for instance. c6 is the main move. White often plays e3 here, but queen c2 is also obviously not unknown at all. Knight f6, e3, and here Anish goes knight h5, which is an incredibly sharp line, which was originally, I think, brought to the attention of chess theoreticians everywhere by Levon Aronian, who played this against Alexander Grishuk in their quarterfinal match in the Kazan candidate matches. Bishop e5 is the only real sensible move here, because you do not want to allow black this trade without at least some concessions. Knight d7, bishop e2, knight takes e5, d5, and g6. And the knight obviously will be quite happily rerouted towards the center if you let it leave. So white generally takes on h5 here, gh. And the brief history of this line, I'm not going to even attempt to go into any kind of detail. But white has a number of options here. In the stem game between Grishuk and Aronian, Grishuk played long castles here, to which Levon replied by playing f6, and eventually won that game. And recently, Etienne Bacrot played this against Andrew Ledger in England, and that game continued queen d7, knight g2, queen g4, knight d4, f6, e6, bishop takes e6, h3, queen g8, and e4. And Andrew had a very promising position against Etienne, although the game was eventually drawn. Apart from long castles, white also can play knight f3, which is probably the most popular move in this position in terms of strong grandmaster practice. Black generally plays f6. It is very much black's plan in these types of positions. Well, types, it's a very unusual position. I don't think it belongs to any type. Black wants to play f6, trade this pawn for this pawn. That actually almost always castle short. And try to develop this bishop to either f5 or in some cases maybe to g4. The other bishop comes to the long diagonal. And yes, the black king side structure is completely destroyed, and he only has those two h pawns as some kind of king cover, but the bishops will be extremely strong. And here there's a lot of theory concerning the line e4, d4, takes, long castle. Black normally plays bishop g4 here, although there was a recent game played between Natalia Zhukova and Bella Khatanashvili in which Bella played castles instead, but bishop g4 is the main theoretical move. And here there's a number of options available to white. You can play something quieter, well, reasonably quieter, like knight e2, which has been tried by Pavel Lelyanov in his game against Alexander Shimanov. And you can also go e5, after which black generally takes on f3, takes on e5. Somewhat surprisingly, that bishop is more alive than it seems, because after something like rook h e1, there is queen g5 check, followed, for instance, by castling long. And somewhat surprisingly, two very high-level games reached this seemingly not entirely forced position. Two games reached move 23 here after rook g3, and Grishuk himself, after losing with white, played this line with black against Alexei Dreyev, and he played king d7, c7 here. And much later in 2016, Kasimdzhanov played rook g6 in this position against Vahidov. That concludes our historical tour. I really didn't even try to figure out which of those options after gh5 are better here for white. That would take me, well, ages and ages. I don't know. I don't know if I can reliably even get to that conclusion. But just to give you an overview of, apologies, grandmaster practice and the state of theory. Alireza instead plays knight g2, which is a move that has been played in high-level practice, but a lot less frequently. f6, ef bishop takes f6, rook d1, also still not a novelty, but Artyom Kovalev, not the Vladislav Kovalev who is playing in the Tata still, but the Canadian Kovalev, played knight f4, h4, g3, long castle, short castle, long castles here. Against Rustam Kasimdzhanov in the, I assume, the Baku Grand Prix 2015. Rook d1, castles, and king h8 probably is a novelty, definitely is a novelty at approximately this level. In the previous game here between Alexei Alexandrov and Alexander Shimanov, Shimanov played queen e8, e4, d4, knight takes e4, and bishop g7. And he was maybe even slightly better after a somewhat indifferent move, knight c3, bishop f5, queen b3, queen e6. And once again, those bishops are so monstrous that nobody really cares about the spoiled structure. But with the queen still on, it was possible for white here to play knight g3, stopping bishop f5. And after h4, there's a very strong reply, knight g5, attacking this pawn, and also creating a very important tactical threat of queen c4 check, queen takes h4. Instead of all that, Anish plays king h8, which is a very, very normal, very reasonable move here. And black already, in similar positions, if you imagine white making some kind of an indifferent move here, black can definitely consider playing queen e7 or queen e8 and meeting e3, e4 with d4, knight e4, and bishop f5, just like here. Because obviously with the king on h8, if you imagine in this position the king on h8, bishop f5 cannot be met by knight takes f6 because it's no longer check. And then in general, I just want to say that this is a bit of a strange impasse, because obviously black would like to move the queen away from the x-ray along the d file, but it's also very important for black to be able to meet the move e3, e4 with the move d5, d4 in some cases. So those two things have to be weighed against each other. As mentioned, king h8 played by Anish, and I think it's a very good move. And in fact, I quite liked that position during the live show, and the computer does suggest that black actually already is doing quite well, and that probably the setup with the knight on e2 and the short castles is probably not the way to challenge the black setup in this line. e4 is what Alireza chose here, d4, and here he played knight f4, which is very logical. He is aiming to place this knight on e2, this knight on d3, and then start pushing in the center. But this line has a tactical drawback, which was very difficult to spot, and spoiler alert, Anish did not manage. But once you commit to e4, d4, it's not that easy to improve, because if you play f4 immediately, it runs into a very strong tactic with queen b6, and with knight a4, black has a discovered check d3, knight takes, we take here, knight takes, we take here, we go rook bishop g4, and one of those knights will get picked up. It's possible, knowing that knight f4, which is the move Alireza made, doesn't really lead to good positions. I tried improving upon it by playing king h1 first, but then black has a very, very efficient strategy. Black can play bishop g7, a useful move, basically, first of all, stopping maybe knight f4 ideas in some cases, and also just sidestepping the attacks on this bishop. White goes f4, and black simply goes c6, c5, allowing seemingly this knight to achieve a very good position on d5. But After b6, let's say b4 and queen d6, it turns out that it's very, very difficult for white to make any kind of progress in the center, because he obviously cannot play e5. And he also can't really play f5 either, because of bishop takes f5. So the knight on d5 looks very pretty, but is somewhat stuck, and black can maybe immediately start attacking it. And there's also, and this is a very important theme in this position, as I found out when I started analyzing it, it's very important for black to create the idea of placing the bishop on a6. This is a fantastic square for this bishop. And this is also very relevant in the game. After knight f4, Anish played bishop e5, which is a very indifferent move. There's definitely some merit to pushing the knight away from the h5 pawn. Bishop e5 more or less forces white to go knight d3. But it also gives white time to get his setup properly in place. Instead of that, I'm sure Anish considered the move which is stronger, which is queen e8, supporting the pawn on h5 and also sidestepping the d file, knight e2. But now I'm pretty sure he maybe even, well, pretty sure is strong, but I suspect he might have just stopped here, because it seems like queen e8 is not really achieving very much. The pawn on d4 is not hanging, but it might become a problem later on, and in general it's just not clear how black is supposed to develop. But specifically here, when you cannot really take on d4 yet, because bishop takes d4 and rook takes f4 will be the reply, black can play b6. And this is a very, very important resource, which actually leads, I believe, to black's advantage here. Black wants to place the bishop on a6, and also, of course, black wouldn't mind playing c6, c5 at a good moment. And the game can continue something along the lines of b4. If white allows c5, black is instantly very happy. After something like this, the computer definitely prefers black here. So white tries not to allow c6, c5, but after bishop a6, rook f1, and the useful little move h5, h4, I'm not sure if it's the only move that gives black advantage, but I think stopping knight e2, g3 makes plenty of sense, even from a human perspective. Black is just better here, because, once again, you cannot do this. It just loses a full piece. And black is ready to play rook d8. In some cases, this bishop actually gets transferred over to h6. There are some positions where this happens. And an attempt to reset your pieces by giving up your central pawn runs into simply queen f5, queen takes c6, rook c8. And once again, the bishops are so strong here that I wouldn't say black necessarily wins this position after queen e4 or queen e6. But black is extremely happy in an endgame like this, because the bishop activity more than compensates for the slightly ruined pawn structure on the king side and the very nicely connected knights on d3 and f4. But as mentioned, I have a feeling Anish, of course, spotted queen e8, but perhaps either did not see or did not appreciate just how strong b7, b6 is here. Instead, he played bishop e5, knight d3, bishop g7, knight e2, h4. And here is an interesting moment, because I suspect this might be the one moment where Alireza definitely had a shot at achieving an advantage, and he sort of let it slip by making the most human and the most understandable move possible, which is h2, h3. Because in general, allowing black to play h3 doesn't seem like it's such a great idea. It challenges your king position. If you meet h3 with g3, black will have a g4 square for the bishop. But it was still probably better to play, instead of h3, to play f4 here, with potentially something like queen e7, e5, and if h3. g3 is fine, but you can also make an argument for playing rook d1, and just being prepared to meet hg4 with rook f2, hg2 with rook f2, and kind of ignoring the pawn on g2, and just preparing to start pushing your initiative in the center. The pawn on d4 is hanging, the knight can sometimes go to g3, and then you start just creating f5, f6, and if that ever happens, black will just get completely rolled over. After h3, though, black will be in time to establish some kind of a blockade, and it will become a lot more difficult for Alireza to make progress. Queen e7. There's also a cute opportunity here to go queen e8 anyway, e5, b6. And somewhat importantly, in a position like this, once again, it's a lot more important for white to generate initiative than it is to pick up the pawn. If you take on d4 and allow black this setup, black is instantly completely fine. It's a lot better for white to play b4, bishop a6, rook e1, and aim once again to play, let's say, knight e4, rook e4, and start pushing the e-pawn. And this position is actually quite promising for white. Queen e7, therefore, is quite normal. e5, rook d8, f4, bishop f5. And here black is just in time to establish this kind of a setup, which, if white didn't spend a tempo on playing h2, h3, would have been a lot more difficult for black. King h2 is Alireza's choice, connected with the idea of bringing this knight over from e2 to, let's say, g1 and f3, which I quite like, because this knight, if you look at white's position, everything stands quite well, but the knight on e2 is not really doing very much. So Alireza deciding to activate that piece is a decision I very much agree with. It seems attractive to try and attack the pawn on d4 instantly by playing queen c4, but black has a very strong reply, a tactical reply here in bishop c8, knight d4, bishop d3, rook d3, queen c5. And I suspect if the players actually got to this position, they just stopped here, because the knight on d4 actually gets lost. But you can continue. You can play queen c3 here, takes, c5, and king f2. And somewhat surprisingly, this position the computer assesses as equal. After something like rook ac8, f5, cd, cd, this king is aiming towards, as usual, I can't draw arrows, king f3, king e4, and then white starts pushing his pawn fist in the center, and there's probably perfectly good compensation for the piece here available to white. But of course nobody plays like this. It's very, very difficult to make this decision in a practical game. King h2, queen e6. Another idea that white may have had by playing king h2 would be to play g4, which is something queen e6 is specifically aimed against, because now black can take on h3, and after f5 there's a very strong reply queen h6, and white's position starts collapsing. So Alireza goes knight g1, bishop h6, and just completely ignores the fact that the pawn f4 is hanging and goes knight f3, which is quite energetically played. Of course you cannot take immediately, because the pin doesn't count for very much when you can recapture some material in response. But black could take on d3 first, take on f4 and play bishop e3. And here the machine actually prefers not knight takes h4, which is a sensible looking move, but knight h2, aiming that knight at the very nice g4 square. And after queen e5 and both knight g4 and also rook f7, I think white has enough compensation for the pawn, although I don't think he is better. Instead, Anish waits for a move, goes queen e6, e7, saying that I don't think you can make much progress, so I will postpone the capture on f4. And here, by playing queen c4, white probably makes an immediate draw, because bishop d3, rook d3, bishop f4, king h1 is probably quite decent for white. But black can play bishop e6, and there is no better square for the white queen than to go back to c2, and black can just repeat here. Alireza instead plays king h1, and here Anish finally picks up that pawn, seemingly keeping both the bishops, but after queen c5, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, we have this strange situation on the board where seemingly black is a pawn up and has two bishops against two knights, but his pieces are positioned in such a way that his material advantage will not stick, and he is not actually better here, but he should be able to make a draw without any problems. For instance, it was possible to play, instead of the bishop c2 move that Anish chose, he could play bishop e3, which is a very logical choice. Of course, you do not want to allow bishop c2, so white goes knight b7, rook d5, and once again, something like knight takes h4, bishop c2 is extremely risky for white. So white takes on d4, and after the simplifications and the move rook b8, the game will eventually extremely likely end in a draw. And a very large factor in the game ending in a draw is this pawn on h4, which means that the king on h1 will find it very, very hard to get out of the corner. Instead, Anish goes bishop c2, rook d4, knight takes d4, bishop e3. And here we enter a bit of a strange sequence of events, because objectively black is not worse at all here. There are really no problems for black to solve in terms of the quote-unquote mathematical evaluation of the position. But I'm pretty sure that Alireza continued playing this position for a win. And at some point he managed to convince Anish that Anish should play this position sort of passively for a draw. In fact, I think the best play for white here is to take and immediately start reactivating this knight towards decent squares, after which, once again, with the king somewhere active, white would be better, but with the king on h1, black has absolutely no problems holding this. Instead, Alireza played knight c6. Now after bishop g6, you actually have to be a little bit careful with the white pieces here. But draw was still available if white goes knight f5, black replies rook e8, knight e3, rook takes e6 is a bit awkward for white because the pawn on e5 is actually not that easy to defend properly. But you can play knight fg7, let's say rook c8, and just knight f5 back. And there's really nothing better for black here than to repeat or to play some kind of a equalish endgame like this. Instead, Alireza goes rook f3. And this is where game really becomes a bit curious, because Anish could play bishop c1 here, which appears to be like the most natural move in the position, moving the bishop away from a square on which it was attacked, attacking the pawn on b2. It does require some calculation, but after rook b3, which I suspect is the reason Anish didn't want to play this position, black actually even has a choice between b6, with a tactical justification of knight takes e6, bishop f7, and to unpin himself, white will have to give up on b2 by playing, let's say, rook c3. And the machine even suggests you can play rook b8, which appears completely idiotic because white can take on c6, but you can play rook e8 here. And once again, the white pieces appear to be not properly coordinated. For instance, knight d4, bishop f7 looks quite attractive for black. And after both b6 and rook b8, white would actually have to work for a draw. You can probably achieve it with precise play, but it's definitely not black who will have to work for equality in those variations. White needs to be somewhat careful. Instead, Anish goes bishop h6. Alireza continues chasing this bishop, and once again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going back to the idea of playing bishop c1 here. Knight h4, bishop b2 is really not scary for black at all. And after b3, rook e8, white once again has to uncork this knight g7, knight f5 maneuver to make sure he is not worse. Instead, Anish took on f5, rook f5, played bishop e3. Already not a very obvious decision. You can play rook e8 here. If rook f6, bishop c1 is actually much better for black, because this setup is not very stable. And the bishop gets to b2 and just picks up on e5, basically. So white goes something like knight d4, and you can play, let's say, king g7, knight f3, bishop e3, or the same moves in the other order. Knight h4, of course, allows bishop d4, attacking both this guy and this guy. And if white plays b3, yet another example of how passive this king is. And black really isn't running any risks whatsoever in a position like this. It should be quite a comfortable draw here for black. Instead, Anish went bishop e3. They were both somewhat short on time here, but not so horribly short on time that these decisions should have been taken, I think. Rook f3. And here, not the final mistake in the game, but perhaps the one that creates all the problems for black in the long run. You can still keep the bishop. It's a very beautiful bishop somewhere around b6, and then play rook e8 next move. And black shouldn't be worried by this at all, with how active his bishop and rook are, and also how passive and cut off this king on h1 is. But instead, Anish goes rook e8, rook e3, rook e6, king g1, assuming, I guess, that the king will simply get to f5. And once it gets to f5, how many problems can he possibly have? Maybe he can even be slightly better in some cases. In fact, I think this is still a draw, but you have to be quite precise here with black. King g7, king f2. One way to make a draw here, but that would be a very, very risky way, would be to play something like c5, rook e4. It's actually kind of useful for black to play h5 here, to make sure he never has to calculate rook g4 check, king f3, king g6. You obviously can get back to this position later in the game as well. King f4 and start counterplay with b5, aiming to play c4, and then at a good opportunity to maybe play rook a6. For instance, rook e2, c4, rook f2, rook a6. But this is extremely scary because you get positions like this, like king e4, rook takes a2, e6, you have to play rook a1. And you have to be really sure you're not losing by force here. I don't think it's very easy to understand that black doesn't lose this position. But I clicked around a little bit and I am somewhat confident that black actually holds this. But the more surefire way to hold this endgame came one move later. Anish played king g6. And of course, white doesn't allow king f5 with comfort and goes rook e3, e4. Reminding black that to play king f5 would be to just give up on h4 because h7 is hanging. And also, extremely relevantly, this is now move 39. And the time trouble actually was definitely in effect, which I think explains a lot about Anish's next two moves. I think the best way to just make sure you don't lose here was to play h5. Once again, it's important to stop rook g4 check shenanigans, king f3, and king g5. And now we've come to a bit of an impasse. And basically, black is now planning to play as many pawn moves as possible on the queen side, getting the pawns to, if possible, to like a5, b5, and c5. And then, at some point, he will have to make a harsh decision. But if he creates enough activity on the queen side, he should be able to hold. Let me demonstrate. I think the most critical line here is something along the lines of b4, b6. White loses the tempo by king f2, king f3. Let's say a5, a4. And this is a bit of a zugzwang for black, because you don't want to allow the e-pawn to move forward. But here black has a trick. Black can play king f5, rook takes h4, and take on e5 with the king. And this is why we made all those moves on the queen side. We wanted to create a passer on the c-file. And now if white takes on h5 after king g4, I think it's immediately obvious that black is not going to lose. Black is probably also not going to win, but with the c-pawn quite clearly being the first passer that gets pushed down the board, black is really not risking anything at all here. And after rook e4 check, let's say king d5, rook e6, king e6, we get a version of the pawn endgame that is similar to the one way they got in the game. But black has made a lot of progress here, and he holds quite comfortably. First of all, importantly, you cannot even play king e4 because you actually kind of lose to h5, h4. Of course, you don't want to freeze out your own king side like this. And after, let's say, g3 and king e5, it's immediately obvious that this is a very, very comfortable addition of the same pawn endgame. And I will just briefly show you how all of these variations go. And here, black is just in time, but it's a kind of a just in time, which is, I think, reasonably easy to assess. Like if you see this position, I think you suspect you're not losing. I'm not sure how confident you can be at all times that you're not losing here with black, but I think it's a reasonably understandable situation here that you feel you should be in time with your counterplay. But instead of h5, Anish goes rook e6, e7, which once again seems like a very sensible thing to do, protecting the pawn on h7 and once again reestablishing the idea of king f5. But Alireza goes king f3, and this is where I think the game gets completely out of Anish's control. And this is extremely unlucky, I think, for Anish that this was move 40. Because there's absolutely no way that he would have taken the decision he's taken here if this was move 41. And once again, I really am not the world's biggest specialist on either rook endings or kings or pawn endings. But I did spend some time trying to figure it out, and I have a feeling had Anish played a5, which is a very good idea, and the one that he came to later in the game, he would actually hold this. And the critical point is, once again, if white tries to stop the progress black is trying to make on the queen side by playing a4 and b3, it's actually possible to start threatening counterplay by playing rook d7. Rook d7 has a double idea of either threatening rook d3 check, planning to play king f5 next move, which is very useful to do when the rook is not on the e-file, because then, let's say after rook takes h4, you can sometimes take on e5 without having to calculate the pawn ending after rook e4 check, rook takes e7. And also, it invites white to play e6, after which the rook returns to e7, and it's much easier to attack on that square. So black wants to play something like king f6 or king e6 or king f5 and just go after the e6 pawn. And the critical line, as far as I could tell, after a5 is rook g4 check. After which we once again get a very similar endgame to the one in the game. This is pretty much the same endgame that they got in the game, with a very, very important difference, obviously, of black having already played a5. And it turns out that with the pawn on a5, this endgame is a draw. It's a draw with very precise play, and specifically after king e4, the only move that draws here is king d6. Also, noticeably after the immediate a4, which is how you're supposed to meet the move a5, you'll see this later in the game, black can play b5, king e4, king d6, king d4, and in this position you can take on a4 even. And once again, there are so many of those little guys still alive for black on the queen side that he is now in time with his counterplay against the white king side. I will not show you all the variations from here, just trust me that white no longer wins this race. And after king e4, king d6, the most relevant line for all these positions is basically that white, with the king on d6, and this is why it has to go to d6, white cannot stop the black progress by playing a4 and b3, because black is in time to play king c5, and just go on the offensive, attacking the white king side with king c5 and king b4. And this position actually is worse for white, somewhat unsurprisingly, because he basically has to switch to defense, and he might just lose here. And after king d6, let's say white goes king f5, black goes b5, and we get into a kind of a race situation where both sides will eventually queen something, and these queen endgames the computer holds quite comfortably. And if you play, after king d6, if you play b3, once again hoping to stop a5, a4 from happening, after b5, let's say g4, c5, very importantly, the pawns on the king side are not far enough advanced that black cannot meet a4 with c4. For instance, here after bc4, ba4, king d4, black can just do this, and the pawns are not really threatening to queen, so black is in time to pick up the c-pawn and then a return to the king side, and it's a draw. And if white goes h4 instead, black goes a4, ba, and this is a kind of a setup that black is very much aiming for here. The pawn is on a4, not on a5, and in all kinds of endgames where there's a race going on, when white has to pick up first this guy and then this guy, and black goes after the white king side, black will be in time to get the king over to c8 and hold. So this would actually hold, and if after king d6 white goes g4, not playing b3, not giving black a hook, black plays a4, let's say g5, c5, h4, b5, h5, king e6. And this is a very important setup once again, because with this pawn formation, after white goes g6, hg, hg, black goes king f6, king d5, and black even has two ways to make a draw here, not one. One would be to play a3, ba c4 is quite clearly a draw, and somewhat cutely, if white goes b3 instead, after c4, bc4, and b4, this guy queens first, so it's a draw. And the second way to make a draw here would be to play c4, creating a threat of a3, of course. And after a3 you can play b4, forcing white to take on c4. And here we have one of the illustrations of that rule, that you need the pawn on a4 and not a5, because white is now not in time to stop the black king from reaching the c8 square. All of these variations would require a lot of precision, of course. It's not trivial to understand that you have to play specifically king d6 here, and I do believe it's the only move that holds. But I think understanding that having the pawn on a5 here is advantageous to not having the pawn on a5, that I think is possible. But once again, move 40, and Anish on move 40 commits a very, very big mistake, goes king f5, rook takes h4. Now there's really no choice, because if you allow, let's say, rook h5 check, you will just lose a very trivial rook endgame in which you don't even have much of counterplay. Takes, check, takes on e7. And here, white actually wins. Like most sensible moves win because most of them lead to very, very similar positions. But very importantly, in most cases, white will have to play a2, a4. And in the game, after king f4, king f6, g4, Anish did play a5. And here, Alireza had to and did play a4. And the line that was sort of confusing, at the very least me, during the live show, is what happens in this position if black doesn't play a5 and plays something like c5. And in this position, once again, it's very important to play a4, because what white wants to happen is to remove as many pawns, well, not as many, but basically remove the a pawns, but leave the b and c pawn alive against the pawn on b2, because that will make him win most of the pawn races. And here the example in question is something like b6, h4, a6, because otherwise how do you create any passers on the queen side? King e4, king e6, g5, b5, white takes, goes h5, c4, king d4, king f5, white goes g6, and then white goes after the b5 pawn, and this setup with b5 and c4 and the king on d4 is quite clearly a very efficient setup for white to make sure that these two pawns never get traded for this one. And of course, with this being the b pawn and not the a pawn, once the black pawns are gone from the board, white wins the pawn ending 1 against 0 very, very convincingly. So Anish played a5. Obviously, he had much less trouble than I had in figuring out that c5 and a4 loses. And once again, a4 is a very important move here, but I think it's intuitively easy to understand that something like b5, b3 is quite good for white, because you need to stop that pawn once again from progressing further down the board. Anish played h6, h4, king e6, g5, hg, and here was the last time Alireza could go wrong. If you take with the pawn, b5, b3, and king f7, black is actually once again in time. After something like king e5, king g6, the king will be able to pick up the pawn on g5 and then return to c8. But if you take with the king, none of that is true. For now, white simply threatens king g6 and the h-pawn queens. So king f7 needs to be played, king f5, b5, and you don't even need to play b3 anymore. You can just play king e5 and go after these guys, because the h-pawn is so far away and the surviving pawn is on such a nice square on b2 that black just has to resign. So here Anish did throw in the towel. A very, very impressive game by Alireza, where that was his, as you can see on the screen, that was his first ever meeting with Anish Giri, who is a mainstay of top-level tournaments and has been for a very, very long time. And Alireza got surprised in the opening and stayed afloat with some help from his opponent, but stayed afloat, had a nice position. Then his position deteriorated somewhat, but he never really lost faith, and somewhat impressively, I really do think that he continued playing this position kind of for a win, even here, when I think many people would have concluded that there is really no advantage for white to speak of, and would have opted for something more contained, but even with that, you can maybe call it slight loss of objectivity. Alireza continued making very good moves, and eventually Anish went astray, and the technical conversion, once Alireza was given that rook endgame, was absolutely spotless. He did find all the nuances he needed to find, and never really looked anywhere near letting the advantage slip. So once again, a very important game, I think, for Alireza, because I'm pretty sure he will be playing Giri for the foreseeable future. They're both very young, and they will be playing each other in elite tournaments for years to come. So it's a very nice way to set the tone in such an encounter for the Iranian prodigy. This has been a bit of a longer video, but this is a game that I think required a more detailed cover. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you tomorrow for our live coverage of round 6 of Vikings Tata Steel 2020. Signing off, this has been Peter Svidler for Chess24. Thank you for watching.